everybody, welcome to today's CG seminar. My name's Rachel Brooks. I'm based at the University of Oxford and I'm going to be chairing today's session. So welcome. I'm delighted to introduce Polina Ivanova, who's going to be presenting today. Polina is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bremen, and her research interests lie in the areas of international higher education, civil society, and migrant well-being. Her recent publications include Civil Society and International Students in Japan, and also another book on refugees and asylum seekers in East Asia, perspectives from Japan and Taiwan, and that's co-edited with a colleague. Pauline is currently exploring loneliness among international students and highly skilled migrants, and that's the topic of her presentation today. So, Paulina, approximately how long are you going to be speaking for?
I think the idea that is that I'm speaking for approximately 30 minutes and then we leave the rest of it to the Q&A. I will try more or less to, fit within this time frame, but please bear with me if I take 1 minute longer.
Yeah, of course, that's fine. So there'll be plenty of time. There should be plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. But as Pauline's speaking, please do feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat. So Paulina, over to you if you'd like to share your screen.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm going to share now and let me know, of course, if you can see it. In just a moment.
Yeah, that's fine. If you just put it into presenting mode, then we'll be able to.
I think it should be in the presenting moment.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Yes, thank you for your patience, everyone, with my, technical troubleshooting skills. But today I'm going to talk about loneliness as a part of international student experience in the two countries, in the UK and Japan, and how it all fits in the broader conversation on inclusion and well-being in universities. So loneliness has been, we can say that loneliness has been sidelined very much in this broader conversation on inclusion in general and in universities in particular. It may be implied sometimes under mental health or well-being umbrella, but it's not usually explicitly focused on as a key theme in inclusion efforts. The only notable exception was probably the COVID-19 pandemic, when loneliness has really come to the forefront. But again, it was more related to some situational or contextual settings such as lockdown or temporary isolation or mobility restrictions. Another point I would like to highlight here is that well-being at universities has been largely reduced to mental health. And it's actually not the case with the well-being in the original sense. If we look at the original sense of the word is a much broader concept, and we can see that it's multidimensional. It includes various components such as social, person's connections, belonging, community, and also spiritual connection to one's purpose and values. It's something that, again, is not much talked about in academia. Physical, such as sleep, nutrition, and so on, emotional and cultural components that are particularly important for international students going through their intercultural transition. There has been an extensive body of scholarship on loneliness, particularly in the fields of public health and psychology. And it has been well established that loneliness contributes to a variety of mental and physical conditions, addictions, delinquency, dropout at educational institutions, and suicidal ideation. However, the implications of this focus within these two fields, public health and medical science and psychology, was that it has been viewed in a more medical light rather than seeing loneliness as a normal and common human experience. Loneliness has become over medicalized and pathologized, which led to further stigmatization and over relying on medical solutions and neglecting social solutions. In my study, I'm using a definition of loneliness as discrepancy between one's desired and one's actual relationships, which, in my opinion, captures this subjective nature of loneliness. So it's not about having a certain number of friends or a certain frequency of interactions with people. It's highly subjective. In this situation, when one person would feel lonely, the other person would feel completely fine, and the other way around. On the other hand, this term loneliness has been criticized as a kind of overly broad catch-all term. And in response, scholars have come up with various typologies, and some of the relevant typologies for today would be transient loneliness, which is temporary and basically it's a healthy reaction of our system to seeking connection, to highlighting that we need more connections and prompting us to take action, versus prolonged loneliness, which can be much more problematic, as we can guess. Also, objective and perceived social isolation, that's another typology which is relevant. We are all familiar what objective isolation is in a sense, for example, of the COVID pandemic, we all remember well. And perceived social isolation is mainly what we are going to talk about, is when the person is actually surrounded by other people but still is feeling lonely. There has been also many studies on differences across the lifespan, and also various factors that are contributing to loneliness, from individual factors such as introversion or high sensitivity to societal factors, among which, of course, discrimination, racism or othering, and the degrees of openness to the host society, to foreigners, is something that is highly relevant for us today. And final point I would like to also highlight is the body of scholarship on social withdrawal, what actually makes people to withdraw from social interactions. And that can be all sorts of factors, starting from perceived appearance, body image, very important in our 20s and maybe early 30s, for some people all their life, but especially in this time frame, in this age. Also, state of health and finance is often, again, perceived in comparison to our peer group. Speaking of UK anti-loneliness policies, it all started with a Joe Cox Commission on loneliness, and as a result, UK has become the first country in the world to appoint the Minister of Loneliness in January 2018. And I have to say here that the term itself, loneliness minister or minister for loneliness, is a term coined by the media. Officially, it's a part of the portfolio minister for sport, media, civil society, and youth. And I don't have the time today to go through all these policies. I'll just quickly highlight that the main focus was on older people, and later it's also spread to other target groups, such as people living in rural areas, and also LGBTQ community and loneliness in that community. And a second minister for loneliness, Mims Davies, who was a minister in 2018 until July 2019, expressed concern that lonely people should not be seen as potential targets for intervention. And that was also, I thought it was a quite spot-on comment, because they can be, of course, we can easily imagine how it can be counterproductive and make lonely people to withdraw even further. So Japan followed suit and appointed their Minister for Loneliness in February 2021. This was prompted by a wave of suicides in the early stages of the pandemic, particularly among young women. And the main focus areas were also older people and the phenomenon of lonely death, and also younger women because of the suicide wave that I mentioned already, and domestic violence. So this portfolio was called, in the case of Japan, a minister in charge of regional revitalization, decline in birth rate, and gender equality. So it was this heavy focus on women as well. In reality, however, it was all delegated to local nonprofit organizations. That is very common, again, in Japan. There have been a number of joint initiatives, because so far those are the only two countries that have this government position. And in the first meeting, which you can see a picture on the screen, which was online in 2021, when everything was online, both countries agree that they will share data and information on how loneliness is affecting their citizens, their policy and measurement approaches. So that was a joint statement that was published on the UK government website after this exchange meeting. And the language they're using is quite interesting here. As you can see that they are using the word citizens and not, for example, residents or population, which made me think that anti-loneliness policies in the UK and Japan may be targeting citizens and neglecting foreigners, including international students. At the same time, loneliness has been highlighted as an important part of international student security in the previous research, including Professor Marginson's research with his colleagues in the earlier book in 2010. Also, it has been well established that international students are at higher risk of loneliness compared to their domestic peers. And another research gap is on loneliness in migrant communities in general, so not just international students, but other categories or other migrant groups. All of this prompted this research question on how and why international students are experiencing loneliness in countries with anti-loneliness policies. So this is something I'm going to focus on today. I don't probably have the time to go through this slide in detail, but I just would like to say that even though UK and Japan has so many differences, both in migration levels and the number of foreign-born population living in the countries, also in their approaches to higher education policies, including internationalization. Britain is pursuing a highly commercialized model, so they are charging higher fees for international students, while Japan is charging the same fees to domestic and international students, and also a number of scholarships are available, and it's the grant scholarships. It's not a loan type that you have to repay after that. But there is one important similarity, is that both countries are attempting to insulate themselves in a way as island states. They are trying to resist these higher levels of migration and prioritize highly skilled migration. So they have a number of policies based on that. And of course, international students can be seen as a future highly skilled. So in my study, I used a mixed method design. In the first phase, I conducted qualitative interviews with 24 international students, 12 in each country. And in the table on the right-hand side, you can see, not very clearly perhaps, but some of the demographic data on the students I interviewed, their countries of origin, their levels of study, age group, gender, and so on. In the second half of 2024, I conducted a quantitative survey online. I was hoping to get much higher response rate. Unfortunately, I was only able to get 91 valid responses in both countries, which led to some limitations, as I'm going to discuss later. Okay, in the first phase, I asked them a number of questions which again, I don't probably I don't have the time to go through one by one, but it was questions on accommodation, on how safe they are feeling, how supported they are feeling, family support, and so on. And also ask them about organizational involvement, so whether or not they are participating in any student societies or groups or clubs or circles. In case of Japan, that's how it's called. And perhaps they are volunteering off campus as well, in some kind of outside campus organizations, charities, and so on. And I have found that on-campus participation has been pretty similar for both countries, but there was a big difference in the off-campus participation. So in Japan, many students, 7 actively participated out of the 12 I interviewed, and 2 tried but dropped out for various reasons, and 3 never tried. While in the UK it was considerably lower than in Japan. Only 3 participated and 1 tried and dropped out, and 8 never tried. So you could say it was reverse ratio. And regarding the personal relationships, I found again that a little bit more students in the UK had local friends, British friends, compared to those in Japan. Roughly half of them had friends, close friends among co-nationals, and many of them were also friends with other international students, which is also quite typical for international student population in any country. At least any country I have seen so far. Also, they talked about culturally different ways of making friends, particularly for example, East Asian students. They said, well, it's difficult for us to make friends in the bar, for example, which is common in the United Kingdom. Regarding their intimate partnerships, all the interviewees I spoke to in Japan were single without a partner, while in the UK 8 were single and 4 were either married or in a committed relationship. Finally, the most interesting part probably were their comments on their loneliness experiences. So a lot of them said that it's not necessarily lack of interaction that made them feel lonely. It was interacting with the wrong people who were not fulfilling your needs, as one of them has put it. Others spoke of the role of weather, for example. Again, it was in the UK. And some other spoke about PhD loneliness, this kind of solitary container and frustration about missing out on other aspects of life. Others spoke that said that, well, loneliness is often misunderstood. For example, in Japan, loneliness equals hikikomori, which means socially withdrawn. And some complained about being completely isolated, including for extended periods of time. That was a comment that I even included in the slides. For 2 years, said one participant, I have felt completely isolated, and I think that mental health issues don't really matter for Japanese work environment or academic environment. So I found several severely lonely students with few or dissatisfying connections and prolonged loneliness, and 4 of them were in Japan, 2 in the UK. Coping strategies were, quite common and popular ones, such as, for example, working out and joining some groups, getting support from either professional therapists or friends or family, journaling, taking care of others. But there were also some quite unusual coping strategies. So, for example, one created a community of twin sisters. That was very interesting for me. Another one used her technical skills to create a new matching app for Asian students in the UK. While yet another one was engaging in so-called parasocial relationships. So she had some kind of pop music idol group that you could meet online, and she found that it was really helpful to organize these online meetings with them. And it was something that kept her motivated and kept her going. Other themes that were not in the original interview guide, but they came up in the interviews, were, for example, the role of religion. Although religion was important only for 3 out of 24 interviewees, for those who identified as having some kind of religious affiliation. That was a really important factor, both in terms of belonging and also, in a sense, it was a decision-making factor for example, their mobility decisions, whether or not they decided to stay in the country and pursue another program. It was also sometimes problematic, so it wasn't always positive. So, for example, a French Muslim woman living in the UK said she was ostracized by the Muslim community in the country because she was not wearing a headscarf, which was common among unmarried young Muslim women in France, but was not common in the UK. Also, I noticed that more female interviewees reported prolonged loneliness and objective isolation compared to their male counterparts. And that surprised me because I thought previous studies were reporting that men were on average lonelier than women. So I decided to check this with the survey as well. And I also looked at the societal factors that were contributing to loneliness, particularly the impact of discrimination and racism. And there were a number of testimonies ranging from physical attacks and verbal abuse, microaggression, and poor service in restaurants. And also, there was this aspect that some participants called yellow fetish, which was a racial fetishization of East Asian women in the UK that made them very cautious and made them withdraw in some way from certain types of interaction. The role of cultural barriers, understanding jokes, for example, or different ways of making friends was also highlighted. And finally, the factor of social rigidity or the lack of relational mobility. So, for example, several participants in the UK and in Japan said they did not want to become friends with their co-workers at part-time work, not because those co-workers were not nice or not open, but simply because they had not chosen them. So that was also a very interesting comment. For me. If we compare the interview findings in both countries, so I found more severely lonely interviewees in Japan. And also I found that there was lower level of participation in off-campus groups in Great Britain. While personal relationships, on the contrary, such as friendships and romantic partnerships, looked better in the UK. And I thought, well, that may be a possible explanation because students in the UK may find it easier to form personal relationships that may reduce their need to participate in those off-campus groups. However, other explanations are also possible, such as cultural preferences, for example, for more or less structured interactions, or differences in the university support system, or just greater availability of those groups in certain countries. So in the second phase, I constructed a questionnaire of 38 questions in the main part that consisted of 9 thematic sections, and 8 questions in the demographic 8 questions in the demographic sections. All of the questions were optional except the consent form, which was mandatory. And I borrowed most questions from previous surveys and I adapted them for international students. However, I also constructed some based on the interview theme. So, for example, I noticed that directly asking about discrimination often led to participants getting defensive or going into denial, saying, no, I didn't experience discrimination, even though they just described something that was very clearly, in my view, discrimination behavior. And then also one participant described very eloquently how he felt being perceived as a threat and how that impacted him. So I included this question on threat perception in the questionnaire as well. So I wanted to see whether participants experienced loneliness and discrimination differently, depending on the gender, and also whether loneliness and discrimination were connected. So whether, for example, people who were more discriminated or who felt more discriminated were also experiencing more loneliness. Because I had this small sample, only 49 participants in Japan and 42 in the UK, I did not get statistically significant results in most of the tests I ran, but I got some slight trends that I can use very cautiously to discuss the very weak correlation. So one of the tests, man-witness tests, showed that mean rank of loneliness was indeed slightly higher for those who experienced discrimination compared to those who did not. And another Spearman's test showed a very weak correlation between loneliness and discrimination, which was positive in Japan and negative in the UK. I also hypothesized, based on what I heard in the interviews, that there may be an association between gender and experience discrimination. So people may be experiencing discrimination differently depending on their gender. And I had these 8 items on discrimination in the survey. I constructed them in a way that they were describing behavior rather than asking directly, although in some cases I prefer to use the word discrimination. And I also ran a couple of tests, chi-square and a Fisher's exact test. And because, again, of the small sample size, I could not find significant difference between discrimination experiences among male and female students. However, when I looked at like separate items, separate constructs. For example, the one on physical aggression, I could see that more female students reported physical aggression in Japan than male students. However, in the UK, it was the opposite. It was only 2 male students who reported physical aggression. Also, being perceived as a threat, more male students reported it compared to female students in both countries. Again, because the numbers are so small, we have to be very careful with the interpretation. Finally, I wanted to see the relationship between loneliness and withdrawal, because that was something that previous literature really emphasized as having a very strong correlation. And again, the 2 tests did not yield statistically significant results. There was a large difference in mean ranks in the UK, but because the sample only included 40 cases and 37 of them went to the low withdrawal group and only 3 to the high withdrawal group, so that could have also skewed the results. In Japan, there was not significant difference even in the mean ranks. And Spearman's test showed a weak positive correlation, so which means that the people who withdraw more experienced more loneliness, greater loneliness. Finally, I wanted to show one descriptive statistics that were generated by my survey instrument. So there was this question: how many meals did you share with others last week? And there was a range of possible answers from none to 1 or 2, 3 to 6, and 7 or more. And you can see in these two upper charts that they look very similar for both countries. UK is on the left, Japan is on the right, and they looked almost the same. While there was another question, are you currently living alone? It was a binary yes or no question. So here we can see that the chart looks the opposite. Most participants in the UK, 63%, were living with someone else, while in Japan it was the opposite, 73.5% lived alone. But the ratio of shared meals looked nearly the same in both countries. So that means that even though people were living with somebody, they were still eating alone most of the time. And that can be, of course, explained by different schedules or maybe lifestyle preferences, relationship dynamic. But I think it also illustrates how complex and subjective loneliness can be. We all know that alone does not mean lonely, but also it shows that living with somebody does not mean not lonely, if it makes sense. So to conclude, in the interviews, we have seen that male students in both countries reported worse experiences of racism and discrimination, physical and verbal abuse, while female students reporting greater loneliness. However, the survey did not confirm significant gender differences in loneliness and discrimination. They did find slight trends between loneliness and discrimination and weak positive correlation between loneliness and withdrawal. The major limitation for the survey was, of course, this small sample size due to low survey response rate, and also some other limitations of the interview phase was the use of convenience samples. So, for example, I was only able to recruit students majoring in humanities and social sciences in the UK, and some nationalities in Japan were disproportionately represented based on that. So even though the results are not quite as I was hoping for, I'm not giving up, and I'm planning further analysis. So especially for the quantitative part, I'm planning to conduct not just those bivariate tests that I discussed already. It didn't give nice results, but probably some multivariate linear regressions to assess those relationships while controlling for other factors, and also analyze some other variables such as, for example, positive or negative attitude to solitude, which was also part of the survey, but I didn't have the time to discuss it today. I would like to finish with recommendations coming from the students, from their interview comments, and also in the survey they had an option to leave a comment. So some did that. And some were advocating for more flexible on-campus groups because they thought that organizations that are not so strict, they have flexible schedule, they could be really helpful way for international students to get used to life in the host country. And also there was a comment for expanding support for the entire duration of the studies, not just providing orientation at the beginning, but actually providing support for later years, also when students may be facing a different range of issues. Some other comments that came up several times were the importance of staying connected to one's purpose, why they chose to come to the country to study abroad in the first place. So I thought that could be translated into some kind of workshops that universities could offer on building resilience through reconnecting to one's purpose or meaning. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that we should neglect a larger environment. So of course, it's important to strengthen anti-discrimination policies. And it's also important to avoid overly direct anti-loneliness intervention, because that may be counterproductive. As I said, it may cause lonely students to withdraw even further. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments or questions. I think I stopped sharing the screen. At least
Great.
That was, yeah.
Thank you very much, Melina. I can still, yeah, it's going now. Great. Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. We've got a few questions in the chat already, but I would encourage other people to add their questions. Maybe I'll just kick off with one, and then we'll turn to the ones that are already in the chat. I was just wondering whether, particularly when you were doing your interviews, the extent to which your participants were sort of constructing this as a kind of serious social problem, because I guess one way of talking about loneliness is that it's something that everybody kind of experiences from time to time, and it's just part of kind of being a human being. Did they have that kind of perspective, or did they actually think this was kind of a really serious problem that was majorly impacting their time as a student, and therefore required kind of social action?
Thank you for the question. I guess it depends on the student, really, because for some, yes, that have been the case, and some students were indeed severely affected, and they were reflecting very seriously about not just their own loneliness and what was causing it, but also what about other people, and they brought up some examples that they were observing. But I try to interview different types of students, not just those who identify themselves as, lonely. Although I had such students, I said, oh, I'm an introvert, for example, or I am socially awkward. Yes, self-concept played a role. But also I spoke to some students who were not particularly, were quite, I would say, socially successful and had all these various, quite diverse and rich networks and support systems, and they did not think of loneliness as something, So I think it was important to include testimonies from very different individuals to have more balanced perspective. So that was my approach to it. Although, of course, you can approach it completely differently. Definitely.
But I suppose just think about your recommendations, the way you sort of presented those. Am I right in thinking that you do think this is actually a kind of a social problem that needs attention by people who work in universities and others?
No, definitely. I think that way, but I thought the first question was whether they thought, and the answer was not always. Not always. It really depended on the students. Some were surprised that someone was carrying out a research like this, and that actually was the reason why they decided to reach out and volunteer to be my participants. So that was also quite interesting. I think we have another person.
Yeah, so in the chat, we've got first of all a question from Asoda Tivasan. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself, Asoda?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Do you want to also switch your camera on if you can as well?
Sorry, is it
if
okay?
Not, we can hear you, so just go ahead and.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, we can see you now as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm from Mauritius, a small island in the Indian Ocean. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have extensive experience from the field of distance education, and while listening to you, and I see a close parallel between the situation between the distance learner, online learner, and the international student. And I would say that the learner in both situations face the academic, organizational, as well as psychological issues. And based on my own experience and the literature, I would rather say that national policies are important for these learners, but we should focus, I think, on institutional policies, such as the setting up of the proper counseling system for the students. Should it be a referral, proactive, depending on the institutions? Obviously, depending on the funding available within the institution. But within your context, I mean, the UK context as well as the Japanese context, we are speaking about the highly developed countries, whereas in Africa, the situation is different. So this is rather a comment, and I would ask you whether you don't see the parallel. Have you considered this parallel between the online, because you say that the post-COVID era, then things became more focused on the issues of the international students, their loneliness. But the distance learner, the online learner, has been facing the same issues well before this COVID era. In fact, during the COVID era, the online and distance learning has moved from the periphery to center stage, owing to the mixed issues. Well, as far as the solutions based on all these, to cut things short, I would suggest that a more holistic approach should be adopted rather than a fragmented approach, rather focusing on loneliness instead of focusing about the academic. Because when we speak about the academic issues, they are linked to the psychological ones. Because when we are an international student is studying in a foreign country, usually there is the issue of decontextualized knowledge. Here also there is the issue of alienation, organizational. If the institution has not set up the proper institutional structures, then also this would revolve back to the loneliness issue. I would rather categorize everything through the psychological issue. Well, I cut things short. I'd like to have your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very interesting comment. I think this parallel, you asked whether I thought about this parallel with online learners, and the answer would be probably not in that sense that you are presenting it right now. But I understand how they can be, online learners, distance learners can be really pioneers in this type of education that, you know, the mainstream universities were only catching up, as you said, later during the COVID. So they were discovering all these sets of issues, but online learners or distance learners were already familiar with all these issues long ago. I can say that I don't consider myself definitely an expert on this, but I published a couple of things. One was a book chapter on online social capital during the COVID-19 pandemic, how you can, you know, build connection, build social capital in this online environment. It was only in the context of Japan. And another is the article that I co-authored. It was also on loneliness and social engagement, but two different countries, United States and Japan, and was co-authored with three different people, like four of us, the team of us who worked together. So I would say yes, definitely. I agree that institutional policies are more important for students than national policies. I just, you know, I thought it was interesting that those two countries are the first ones in the world having, you know, minister for loneliness, because a lot of countries, they say, yes, loneliness is important, but it doesn't really translate into national policies. So I wanted to see how those policies affecting international students and universities, if in any way. And my conclusion was not very much, at least so far. We don't really see. So I completely agree with you that, you know, counseling system and more holistic approach, as you said, would be much more beneficial. Yeah, thank you again for the comment.
Thank you, Angelina. And we've got quite a few questions now. So I'll take Phoebe, who's put a question in the chat, then the two people who've got their hands up, and then we'll go to you, Alberto, after that. So Phoebe, do you want to ask your question, please? If you want to unmute and switch your camera on.
Hiya. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I am currently a student who's looking towards studying in a Japanese university, possibly like Waseda or University of Tokyo, purely for their inclusion of international students and trying to prevent loneliness. So is the enacted Act of Advancement on Measures to Address Loneliness and Isolation in Japan, the Article 14 from April 2024, is it an effective solution to reducing the population that's affected by lonely deaths and shut-ins, or is its impact on students limited compared to more senior or older unmarried populations that have probably spent half of their life already having issues with social isolation and loneliness?
Thank you for an interesting question. I am not specializing really on the issue of lonely death and hikikomori. This is a topic that has been, you know, I would say it's more discussed by the media than actually the focus of policies, at least from what I have seen so far. Yes, the act that you mentioned exists. To what extent it is effective, I am not in a position to say, unfortunately. So maybe when you actually go and do your program, whether it's a full degree program or exchange program, you will be in a better position to explain to us right now. But yes, you are right. It's a completely different population. Students, generally they tend to be much younger. Most people I spoke to and had included as a survey participants were in their 20s or early 30s. I had a couple of participants in their 40s or 60s. I didn't have anyone in their 50s. Strangely, I had a gap in that age, but that is, I would say, exceptional cases, really like outliers. So I would say this act probably relates, the act that you mentioned probably relates to completely different population groups, not the ones that I was studying. But good luck with your studies in Japan. I had a very good time there. So I hope you will also enjoy it. It was a fascinating time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paulina. Thank you, Phoebe, for your question. We'll go now to Jan. You've got your hand up online. Do you want to unmute and switch your camera on and ask your question, please?
Hi, Paulina. My name is Yan Guo. I'm a professor from University of Calgary, Canada. Right now, I'm visiting Oxford University. So I really enjoy your presentation. I think the topic is really understudied about international students. In your recommendation, I know you didn't have much time. You talk about strengthening anti-discrimination policies. So I would like to hear you expand on that point, because during the pandemic, a lot of international students, particularly Chinese and Asian students, experience anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism. So did they also talk about the connection between racism and the loneliness? And then, what would the anti-discrimination policy look like, and what you are hoping to see it will have impact on the experiences of international students?
Thank you very much for your very kind comment and interest in the topic and in this presentation. Thank you for making the time to attend it live also during your research stay in Oxford University. So yes, to answer the question, definitely it is a very important and serious issue, particularly the issue of anti-Asian racism that arose during the pandemic. I did another study, also co-authorship. It's published actually by the Center for Global Higher Education as a working paper, co-authored with Sabine Krajewski, who was working at Macquarie University in Australia at that time. And we did a co-authored study on the situation on international students in Japan. It was during the pandemic. Basically, we started slightly earlier, and then the pandemic started, and it shifted our focus. And definitely, there was a lot of, almost you could say, a campaign online and also in real life, blaming certain countries for spreading the virus. And I would say it was not, strangely, it was not better in Japan. Where, even though it's such close countries, but there was also a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment there as well. While in Australia, it was almost, was almost absurd, because anybody who looked Asian, regardless from where they come from, could have been attacked or, experiencing some kind of verbal abuse situation. And of course, it's unfair to say that it was a mainstream population who was doing that. It's as usual. There are some minorities, some idiots, let's say, who are very loud, and they make their voices very loud. So it would not be fair to blame Australians in general or Japanese people in general, because also there was a lot of compassion. For example, Japanese government paid compensation 2 or 3 times, I forgot how many, financial compensations for those international students who were staying in the country, because you may know that Japan has completely closed the international borders longer than some other countries, and that of course affected international students who were not able to travel as much. And also they were severely affected actually in both countries, both Australia and Japan, because the pool of part-time jobs that they were relying on in terms of their income was shrinking, and they were not able to get enough income. So some of them were in very a crisis, really crisis situation. And in Japan, government tried to mitigate this with this kind of financial aid. Not enough, in my opinion, but still better than nothing. And in Australia, there was also this community campaign raising awareness of the international student contribution to the community, not just in terms of financial contribution, the tuition fee that they are paying, but also cultural contribution, them being, cultural ambassadors for their country. So I would say that anti-discrimination policies should be holistic, just as the previous commenter said. It's not just, forbidding people saying certain things or using certain words or like certain types of jokes or certain calling people names. This is very narrow. This is open discrimination. It's not enough. It's much more important to, address those issues holistically and raise, for example, awareness of the contribution of international students, for example, to the local community. This is just one of the examples that come to mind. Maybe I should stop here because we still have some other people waiting. But thank you very much again for your question.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, Jan. Yes, Olivia, would you like to ask your question, please?
I'm Olivier from France. In French
we can't hear you very clearly. If you could speak up, because you're very quiet.
Yeah, sure. So I'm French. I've got no Oxfordian accent. I beg your pardon. And I haven't listened to all the presentation, but I'm interested in that because we work here in France about inequalities, and I would like to know if this is discussed as a matter of inclusion and well-being.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. Inequality is a big part of this conversation. I had a slide, maybe since you mentioned that you joined us a little bit later. Thank you for joining, by the way. I had a slide at the very beginning saying that common themes of inclusion conversation actually include, as you know, things like gender and class and social economic stages. And I think these are typical ones, common ones that we are somehow used to hear about, more or less. Things like disability, things like neurodiversity are more or less something that we hear about more often. The reason why I decided to focus on loneliness, that it's been relatively neglected compared to other issues. But of course, if you look at loneliness, it's a very complex phenomenon, and it's not just I was trying to say, at least with my presentation, it's not just individual matter. Of course, it is a personal matter. It makes individuals suffer, but it's not just that. It's also related to these social systems, and it's related to many other factors, including, for example, social inequalities or economic inequalities. I mentioned very briefly that one of the reasons why people choose to withdraw from social interactions is that they perceive that they are less financially capable to, going out with their friends. I haven't had a question like this in this survey. And I had a couple of questions. I had one question on the magic wand. If you had a magic wand that could change one thing about yourself, what would you choose? And first, the leading answer was my appearance. And I thought, okay, maybe because they're young, it's really important for them. But then very quickly, as I started getting more responses, financial sector become really prominent. So a lot of them thought that, if I had more money, I would have been able to socialize more, to go out with my friends more. So there is, of course, a direct relationship with loneliness of all those factors.
And can social inequalities encompass the loneliness, like the size of your network, of your social network, your coefficient of centrality? Well, and then you're talking about during the presentation about ethnicity and migrations. So are there local inequalities due a degree of foreignness that makes you strange and stranger? Would it be unequal as well, or is it? How would you formulate it?
Paulina, as we're a little bit short of time, can I ask Alberto to ask his question as well? And then maybe you could respond to both of them before we finish, if that's okay, because I'm conscious that Alberto's been waiting quite a long time. Alberto, do you want to ask your question, and then Paulina can respond to both of them?
Yes. Hi, Paulina. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation, and maybe something that is not on the radar of many people, I would say. At the beginning of your presentation, you started at mentioning that you chose UK and Japan because they actually had policies or ministers in order to address loneliness. And I wanted to try and understand if any of your interview question linked directly to the available support that is available to students that are not citizens, because that's what I thought you mentioned. And for example, at some point you mentioned that some turn to friends and others to counseling, and that for me typically is something that is more available to citizens or permanent residents rather than temporary or students and these sort of things. And the follow-up question would have been how that was linked to a probably health system or government or policy system that is more proactive, or rather towards prevention rather than intervention when it is getting serious. Because my experience with the UK is that very much of the health system is emergencies rather than prevention. Hopefully the question was clear enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto. Paulina, we've got a couple of minutes, so if you could be relatively brief in your response, that'd be much appreciated.
Yes, I'll try my best. Thank you. So first, regarding the size of network, I didn't explicitly do network analysis and try to avoid this kind of approach when you really judge how lonely the person is or how not lonely someone is based on the sheer number of friends, for example, the number of interactions. Although I do recognize that it is important. At least this says whether the person is objectively isolated or not. But because loneliness is so subjective and so much of it is perceived rather than actual, so I thought I would stay away from this. Next, regarding ethnicity, I definitely noticed that Black students experienced more racism and more discrimination in both Japan and the UK. Next, the question was whether resources were available to non-residents, and the answer would be yes. For example, in Japan, they had counseling systems both in English and in Japanese. It was free for students regardless whether they were citizens or not, so it didn't matter. Also, Japanese health insurance covers everyone equally. It does not matter whether you are a foreigner or not, but you have to have, of course, regular status. So if you are a irregular migrant, then of course it can be much more problematic because the person doesn't have documents. But in case of international students, 99.9% of them are completely regular, so they have no problem with coverage. I know that is not the case for many other countries, and many countries, as you said, are focusing on, putting off fires and, dealing with emergencies rather than actually proactively, promoting health, promoting well-being, rather than, doing those things. So again, my sample was limited, so I have only talked to students from specific institutions. Many of them were also from privileged background and were studying also in privileged institutions, the kind of higher tier institution in both countries. So that could have, of course, affected the results. However, I also heard testimonies of people who were literally starving and were using food banks, for example, in Japan, in order to get food supply during the pandemic, when their parents back home could not send them enough money. So there was a lot of discrepancy. So it was not very clearly cut. But yeah, to answer your questions, at least counseling services are available to all who are enrolled as students, and health coverage is also available for everyone. So I think partly it covers your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulina and Alberto. Sorry to have to rush you there at the end. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I'd like to thank you, Paulina, for a really fascinating talk, and thank you to everybody who asked questions. And there was a nice dialogue there in the second half of the session, so thank you for that. Just a reminder that we have our next CG webinar next Tuesday at the same time, where we'll be looking at higher education publishing, specifically open access journals. And then we've also got our hybrid CG conference at the start of April. So do sign up for that if you'd like to join us then. But big thank you to Paulina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for your active participation. Thank you
Bye-bye.
for giving me another opportunity to present. Bye.